Hey, what's up, Liron here. Today I want to show you a two-steps process for painting wet in wet. I think it's a really useful one and it's kind of repetitive in a good way. It will show you how to approach this in your paintings and make the most out of watercolor. So let's get to it. So I thought it would be cool to also film. Hopefully you get to see me also. Maybe I'll decide to cut it out and not include it, but just letting you know. So here we go, get started with the process. The cycle is very simple, and this is car number 69 of my 100 cars challenge. What I want you to focus on is first create a shape with the paint, and then apply wet in wet to it. Just like I mentioned in the intro, it's nothing too complex, but I find that I have to remind myself this during the process. So what do I mean by that? First, I open up a shape. So in this case, it's this kind of a brown, warm color. And then I switch a bit into some purple for the right side. And once I have that shape, once I'm comfortable with the shape I painted, only then do I start to do some wet in wet on it. So there are two components involved here that I found is very useful. One, it's very important to adjust the shape to be accurate and to make sure that it looks good before you start applying wet in wet. It's just a good process for me personally. I find it works well. And the second thing is to remind yourself to pause every shape you create, to give yourself time or the option to do wet in wet, right? You're not going to always do this, as I mentioned, but just as a general idea, it is good to have in mind the possibility. Why? Because wet in wet is what brings out, I think, a lot of the beauty in watercolor. Those gradual transitions are key for attaining a watercolor look, for getting things to flow, for getting a variety of edges. All of these things are really important. Sorry if the ambulance comes through the video. My apologies. Hopefully it's not too bad. Now you see, once I have that section, I'm comfortable with it, I then start doing wet in wet. Now, this is a relatively big shape because it's the entire background around the car. But it's also quite simple. There is a bit of a kind of detailed, subtle details next to the figure and around the car itself, but it's a pretty simple shape. So I allowed myself to open up that entire shape, right? But I would recommend not to necessarily do very large shapes. Maybe sometimes it's wise to do the wet and wet while the shape is still small, right? Now, one more thing I'm doing here is merging and letting the background flow into this wash. Everything is still quite light, so I can afford to do that, right? And then once I have that section in, you see I'm working carefully on the shape. Once I feel comfortable with the shape, only then will I start doing some wet in wet. And by the way, and this is really interesting, this applies also to lifting, like you just saw me do now. As long as you keep your shape not too big, right? So it's still manageable. You can do a lot of manipulations with it. I have this other video called real-time value control or real-time wash control that is very useful. All you really have to pay attention to is that shape. You open up a shape and you look at it. Is it too light? Is it too dark? You can do all sorts of things to it. Inject wet in wet real fast, lift real fast, and change a lot, make a lot of corrections. Because a big fear people have is, did I put the right value / color / whatever, temperature on paper? And the reality is, it's hard to do that. It's hard to always make sure you put the right value. That's just not how it works. So a big part for me is, of course, understanding how to mix the right color and value, but then also understanding it's not the end of the world if you don't manage to get it right the first time, and then knowing how to fix that mistake, right? Now look at what I'm doing here. I'm mixing a very, very thick paint because I'm going to make use of wet in wet once again. And I didn't even paint the entirety of the cast shadow under the car because there's no need to. All I need is that smooth edge near the edge of the car and where the shadow begins. Had I done pre-wet this entire section underneath, there is an issue with that now I have to combat the wetness on paper, which is something I mention a lot. Don't do wet in wet unless necessary in this case, because then you have to really battle against all the water you put on paper, where you could have just mixed a thick paint that's relatively dark and get that dark value much more easily, right? Now I opened up the shape and now I can start doing more wet in wet. A few things here. This is yet another pretty significant shape, and I feel confident with it because I have some experience, and I have some experience with cars in particular, right? So that's that. But one thing to really have in mind is the ratio, water to paint ratio. With that wetness on paper, it takes a very dark wash sometimes to make sure that it actually stays, doesn't spread out anywhere in all directions. So when you look at my palette, I am mixing quite a strong paint. The wetter the area I'm working on, right? So the faster I'm doing the wet and wet, the thicker the paint is gonna get. If some time has passed, you can kind of afford sometimes to maybe not go as strong. On the other hand, you run the risk of getting backgrounds. So it's kind of not trouble necessarily, but you need to pay attention to a lot of things in all different directions. Now, I'm doing this dry brush streaks on the street for a couple of reasons. The main one I'm doing it now is I wanted to combine it with the cast shadow under the car because I think it looks so cool. So now I connected the shadow with that detail on the street. Now the detail on the street, and now everything is wet, by the way. It was a nice smooth transition. Everything is dry. Everything is dry now. It's not wet in wet. Okay, I'm reapplying another wash and starting to darken whatever is necessary to darken. But yeah, I wanted to. This gives the street, the asphalt, a feeling of like it's actually you can touch it, right? It feels like it's there. It's solid. It anchors it. It makes it the ground, right? If it was just white and empty, I don't know if it would have looked as good or as, Now, another cool thing about it, this dry brush marks, is look at how it contrasts all of the blended and smooth edges on the car, which are very smooth at the moment. So it's another thing I like to do. If I have a lot of wet and wet and a lot of blended shapes and stuff like that, it's nice to negate it with some dry brush. You only want to make sure one thing is happening correctly, and that is the balance between the two, right? So it's not just about throwing some smooth edges, throwing some dry brush. Where you put the dry brush matters, how dark it is, all sorts of things that I can't even just give you a rule to follow. You have to taste them and see what works well for you and also what you enjoy as a final look. I will say that if you have a big painting, even if there's a lot of wet and wet in it, you still want to use those dry brush marks strategically, so not necessarily, let's say, near the edges of the painting, because that can divert a lot of attention from it, right? You want to keep them still in a place where they're visible. Maybe it's a secondary focal point. Maybe it's the main focal point, right? But yeah, so applying this thin coat over everything. It's kind of a glaze, actually, because I needed to darken everything just a tad bit compared to the previous step. And I kind of rolled with this blue, the French ultramarine, with a bit of that red, Parylene red, and a bit of Indian yellow. I didn't go for that, what would you call that, blue azul, or a more kind of pale, pale azul kind of paint, maybe a pale turquoise blue. It's definitely not a warm blue, but I kind of wanted to simplify my palette and use just one blue. And French ultramarine or ultramarine blue are always handy. But in any case, now it's time for some wet and wets, okay? And that process will repeat itself all throughout the painting. Apply a wash and do wet and wet. The more of a beginner you are, the less confident you feel, the smaller you want to keep your shapes, right? Paint a small shape, do some wet and wet on it, see how it goes. Paint another small shape, do some wet and wet on that, see how that goes, right? As long as you do that, you can't really mess up the painting. And a lot of people are also worried about, again, everything has to mix together or feel like there's flow. You can actually solve that problem with wet and wet, because you can avoid the need to do an initial wash that connects everything together, or very often I'll see artists that are very skilled, very experienced, and what they do is they use like a controlled way of wet and wet. So they'll use wet and wet in some areas, but it's very contained within those areas, and everything else around it will be hard edges and individual shapes painted individually. And that can go against the idea of, in watercolor, merge as many shapes as you can, because it's just an idea. It's just someone's opinion, right? You have to find out what works best for you, and the style of contained wet and wet can work really well for many people. It's a contained smooth transition in a way. Now you saw me lifting a bit from the back of the car. This had a few I guess purposes. One was to make a bit of a distinction between the car and the background, but honestly it's not as important because we have that on the top of the car. And now we have the person here. One thing to note is, especially where the hand is, the skin tone, I wanted to kind of balance it with all those blues, so I went a little warm. Skin tones tend to be in strong sunlight, tend to be sometimes a little stronger saturated. Sometimes it depends on where the light comes from, but very often light can create different moods and atmospheres, right? So sometimes a light can dim everything, mute everything. But sometimes, like in this case, I feel like a good, nice saturation would benefit it, so I went with that. Now you see I accidentally dropped some paint there, and you kind of just smear it around, works well. Looks like a part of the road or whatever. And we're moving on to some of the final stages. So a couple of things. If you look at the front glass of the car, it is darker because you see through it and you see the background behind it. So I wanted to darken it, not as much as maybe in the reference photo. And then once I have that shape, I can start doing some wet and wet, right? Same process. It's the exact same thing. This one is more contained, right? It's a more contained wet and wet, but that gives it this see-through feeling, right? And after that, honestly, all that's left is just the small details. So where the doors connect to the body of the car, the chassis, whatever we call it, the separation between the doors, small details like the doorknobs. In this case, I actually got it already, but all of these small parts. They give it also some solidness, and that's cool in its own right, but it also works well with the previously painted wet and wet. Now, I love these lines that I'm painting right now because they give you an idea of the shape of the body of the car. I really like that. They describe its surface. If it's wavy, if it has a sharp turn in it. These are things you always want to pay attention to. It was very present in one of my recent cars for the 100 Cars Challenge. It just describes the shape of the body of the car, and it's a great opportunity to add that sense of solidness and sense of form to it. So just something I recommend doing. A bit of a license plate details, just darker touches here and there, but this is really almost done. Like we're about 30 seconds away from finishing it. I have my lifting brush. I don't even remember if I lifted anything else. Maybe a bit of that sharp highlight there. Sometimes I'll go over things and kind of lift back and then darken and do these two simultaneously. Actually, you've seen it in the last live stream where I used opaque paint to bring out some highlights, and then I used the dark paints to bring out darker details, right? So sometimes you'll put opaque paint, sometimes you'll lift, like here. Especially near the tire, I felt like that was an important detail because it does tell the story of the shape of the body of the car. And that's just something that can enhance it a lot. And yeah, here's the final result. I really love the granulations and the way I tackle where the tires are and how it switches from that strong blue to a stronger, I guess, purpley blue with a bit of yellow in it. But yeah, really fun process. I hope you enjoyed this one. Let's wrap it up real fast. So thank you so much. Once again, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you can learn to use this cycle all throughout a painting and just improve this technique, you will be able to then just kind of set it aside, throw it away, and utilize it whenever you want. You don't have to do the entire painting like this. And obviously, some stages here are just applying details or adding smaller details or painting smaller sections. But very often for the first stages, this is a very effective way of achieving a beautiful result. It also makes the most out of watercolor, of these gradual transitions, and a lot of fun stuff that just watercolor offers. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Don't forget to check out the frustration-free watercolor course, the Draw Anything course, and also the gallery. I have currently a discount 20% off. Use code NOV21. I hope to see you there, and I will see you in the next video.